clever ground beef tricks Grandma swore by, and we forgot still bring a smile today. Back then, ground beef was stretched and seasoned into meals that felt bigger than the pound she started with. What other kitchen magic have we quietly lost? Mixing in oats instead of breadcrumbs was one of Grandma's thriftiest and most reliable tricks, and it worked better than most of us realize. Rolled oats blended right into ground beef without taking away from its flavor, and because they absorbed juices, the beef stayed moist instead of drying out. Oats also gave meatloaf and patties a lighter texture that felt more filling, which mattered when you were trying to stretch a single pound to feed an entire table. For families who grew up in leaner times, this clever substitution was about more than thrift. It was about making meals last. Oats were affordable, always in the pantry, and easy to work with, which made them the perfect stand-in when breadcrumbs weren't available. The beauty of this trick is how seamlessly it fit into daily cooking. Most people couldn't even tell oats were hidden inside. Today, it's often overlooked because modern recipes default to breadcrumbs. But in truth, oats gave those classic dishes their old-fashioned heartiness. It wasn't just about saving money, it was about getting the most out of what you had and never letting an ingredient go to waste, which was the very spirit of Grandma's kitchen. Stretching with mashed potatoes was another clever way Grandma turned a little beef into a lot of dinner. Whenever there were leftovers sitting in the fridge, she didn't let them go unused. Instead, she folded the mashed potatoes directly into ground beef. The result was a creamy, hearty mixture that could be shaped into patties, baked into casseroles, or fried into crisp cakes that still tasted rich and filling. Potatoes not only extended the beef, but also added a silky texture that breadcrumbs or flour couldn't match. It was comfort food through and through, with a flavor that spoke to both frugality and warmth. Families who grew up on potato-stretched beef never forgot the way it felt to eat something so satisfying, even when times were lean. This wasn't a compromise, it was a form of creativity that made each bite taste more substantial. Instead of thinking about what was missing, you thought about how clever the dish was, how it filled the belly, and how Grandma always seemed to know how to make just enough food for everyone. These days, we often discard leftovers or reach for more meat, but the potato trick proves a pound could go further than you thought. Adding grated carrots or zucchini into ground beef was a quiet, clever trick that served multiple purposes in Grandma's kitchen. It wasn't only about making the beef stretch further, though that was a big part of it. It was also about slipping in extra nutrition without anyone noticing. Carrots added a natural sweetness that balanced savory flavors, while zucchini added moisture that kept burgers, meatloaf, or casseroles from drying out. Grating the vegetables fine meant they disappeared right into the beef, and kids usually had no idea they were eating vegetables at all. In a time when every ingredient had to be used wisely, this method made sense because it extended protein portions and made meals healthier at the same time. It also gave the beef more body and volume, turning one meal into two without anyone feeling shortchanged. This trick carried a sense of care, because Grandma knew how to make meals nourishing as well as filling. Today, with rising costs and an emphasis on hidden veggies, this old idea feels surprisingly modern. It's a reminder that cleverness in cooking was never about fancy ingredients, but about small adjustments that turned the ordinary into something bigger and better than expected. Binding with evaporated milk was one of those subtle secrets that most people never realized was happening behind the scenes. Canned milk was a pantry staple, always on hand when fresh milk couldn't be counted on, and Grandma knew exactly how to use it to improve ground beef. Adding just a splash into meatloaf or burger mixtures gave the beef a tenderness it wouldn't have otherwise. It softened the texture, made it more cohesive, and added a richness that made the dish taste like more than the sum of its parts. The slightly concentrated flavor of evaporated milk also enhanced seasonings, blending them through the meat in a way that felt balanced and smooth. For many households, it was an invisible step that made the difference between a dense, heavy loaf and one that cut easily and stayed moist. This was a time when nothing in the pantry went ignored, and canned milk was versatile enough to become a secret weapon in savory as well as sweet cooking. Today, we pass by evaporated milk without thinking, but in Grandma's kitchen, It was part of the quiet magic that made ground beef meals taste better than you remembered. Using rice as a filler was one of the oldest and most dependable tricks for making ground beef go further. Grandma could take a single pound of beef and, with the addition of rice, stretch it into a whole pot of hearty food that filled every plate. Sometimes she used cooked rice, folding it in to bulk up casseroles and stews, while other times she used raw rice, letting it absorb juices as it cooked right alongside the beef. This was how porcupine meatballs became a household favorite, fluffy grains poking out from tender beef in a tomato-based sauce. It wasn't just about thrift, though. Rice added body, absorbed flavors beautifully, and made each bite feel substantial. In times when budgets were tight, this clever trick allowed families to keep eating beef dishes without breaking the bank. It was practical, resourceful, and tasted so good that no one felt they were missing out. Even now, the combination of beef and rice has a homey, comforting feel to it, reminding us of tables where nothing was wasted and meals always seemed to stretch just far enough to feed everyone gathered. Flavoring with Worcestershire sauce may sound simple today, but for Grandma it was a genius shortcut that elevated humble beef into something richer. Just a few drops added layers of flavor that made plain ground beef taste almost like a steak. The tangy, savory depth of the sauce seeped into every bite, transforming burgers, meatloaf, and skillet meals into dishes that felt more special than their modest ingredients suggested. At a time when seasoning options were limited and spice cabinets weren't as stocked as they are now, Worcestershire was a miracle in a bottle. It was affordable, versatile, and long-lasting, which made it a kitchen essential. Families grew up on meals where that little splash of sauce was the secret no one talked about but everyone tasted. It gave ground beef a boldness that kept it from feeling repetitive, even if you ate it several times a week. Today, with so many sauces and condiments available, this old trick feels almost too simple to remember, but its impact remains undeniable. It was a way of making the ordinary extraordinary, with nothing more than a quick shake of the bottle. Making a gravy base from beef drippings was one of the most practical and delicious habits Grandma swore by. After frying ground beef, she never just poured off the pan juices, they were too valuable to waste. Instead, she whisked in flour, maybe a splash of broth or milk, and built a flavorful gravy that could be ladled over mashed potatoes, bread, or noodles. This simple act turned a basic skillet of beef into a complete, comforting meal that stretched to feed more mouths. It gave dinners depth and warmth, making even small portions feel satisfying. Families relied on this trick not only because it saved money, but because it created flavor from what others might have discarded. The aroma of that sizzling gravy filled kitchens and promised a meal that was both hearty and resourceful. These days, we're often told to drain and discard fat for health reasons, but back then, every drop was an opportunity. That was the beauty of Grandma's cooking, knowing how to turn scraps into something rich, flavorful, and worth remembering long after the plates were cleared. Shaping beef into steaks was one of those clever illusions that made dinners feel fancier than they really were. With a bit of seasoning and careful shaping, Grandma could take plain ground beef and press it into oval patties that looked like individual cuts of steak. Once browned in a skillet and topped with gravy or onions, they gave the impression of a hearty, steakhouse-style meal without the cost of real steak. For families who couldn't often afford higher cuts of meat, this trick was a way to enjoy the feeling of indulgence without breaking the budget. Kids grew up thinking they were eating something special, and in a way, they were. The special part was how much love and creativity went into making dinner stretch. The technique wasn't complicated, but it carried a sense of pride in serving meals that looked more extravagant than they were. Today we call it Salisbury steak or Hamburger steak, but the heart of it is the same, turning ground beef into something greater than the sum of its parts. It was resourcefulness wrapped in flavor, and it left memories stronger than the meat itself. Saving bacon grease for frying beef was one of Grandma's quiet secrets for adding depth to otherwise simple meals. Whenever bacon was cooked, the fat was carefully poured into a tin or jar and kept on the counter or in the fridge. Later, when it came time to brown ground beef, she'd scoop in a spoonful, letting the smoky, savory flavor mingle with the meat. This gave even the plainest beef dishes a richness that couldn't be matched by oil or butter. It wasn't just about taste either. It was about never wasting something that could be used again. Bacon grease was considered liquid gold in many kitchens, and it flavored everything it touched. For ground beef, it was transformative, turning ordinary patties or gravies into meals that tasted indulgent. Today, we often discard bacon drippings without a thought, but back then, this was part of a cycle of cooking that made sure nothing went to waste. It's a trick that not only saved money, but also gave dishes the kind of flavor that sticks in your memory long after the meal is gone. Cooking with onion soup mix was one of those mid-century hacks that made its way into countless beef recipes, and for good reason. The packets were cheap, shelf-stable, and packed with onion flavor that instantly transformed ground beef. Grandma would sprinkle it into meatloaf, burgers, or casseroles, and suddenly the dish tasted like it had been seasoned all day. The dried onion flakes added texture, while the seasoning mix brought a savory depth that was hard to achieve with just salt and pepper. For busy households, it was a shortcut that never felt like cheating, because the results were always so satisfying. Families grew used to the rich flavor it gave their meals, and the convenience meant it became a pantry staple in many homes. Today, with so many seasoning blends on the shelves, onion soup mix feels almost quaint, but it was once revolutionary in its simplicity. It proved that with a single packet, a plain pound of beef could be turned into something memorable. This trick was less about being fancy and more about being clever, and that's exactly why it became one of Grandma's sworn-by secrets. Mixing in stale bread soaked in milk was one of those Depression-era tricks that turned necessity into brilliance. Instead of wasting old bread, Grandma would soften the slices in milk until they were almost mush, then fold them straight into ground beef. This gave the meat extra volume and body, while the milk kept it tender and juicy. It was a way to bulk up meatloaf, burgers, and patties without making them dry or heavy, and no one at the table felt like they were eating less meat. The bread simply disappeared into the mixture, leaving behind a moist, flavorful dish that stretched further than a pound should. This practice also reflected a mindset where nothing went to waste and every scrap was valuable. Today we might see it as a quaint old trick, but back then it was survival and comfort in one. It made meals not only possible but memorable, because they were built out of creativity as much as ingredients. With this method, Grandma could take what might have been thrown away and transform it into something hearty, filling, and deeply satisfying, a true testament to the resourcefulness of kitchens from that era. Doubling portions with cabbage was one of those clever ideas that made a little beef feel like a feast. By shredding cabbage thin and frying it right alongside the ground beef, Grandma turned one modest pound of meat into a skillet, brimming with flavor and substance. The cabbage absorbed the drippings, carrying the richness of the beef into every bite, while adding bulk that made plates look generous and complete. What could have been a small meal suddenly became a dish that felt abundant, filling the house with the smell of comfort as it simmered away. This trick also worked quietly to add vegetables into family meals, making them more balanced without anyone noticing. For children, it was simply dinner, but for adults, it was a careful solution to tight budgets. The sizzling pan of beef and cabbage often became the centerpiece of the table, warm and steaming with pride. Even today, beef and cabbage together carry a sense of hominess, proving that resourcefulness was just as powerful as extravagance when it came to feeding a family well. Using tomato soup as sauce was one of Grandma's simplest but most dependable shortcuts for flavor. With a single can of condensed tomato soup, she could take plain ground beef and transform it into a meal that was hearty, tangy, and comforting. The soup added moisture, preventing casseroles, skillet suppers, or even simple beef and rice dishes from becoming dry or bland. Its sweet, slightly tart taste gave the meal a richness that stuck in memory, tying dishes to the familiar red and white cans stacked in cupboards across America. Families grew up with that signature flavor, recognizing it immediately as the taste of comfort. For Grandma, it wasn't about cutting corners, but about using what she had wisely, and tomato soup was a pantry item that always delivered. With one can and a pound of beef, she could have a hot dinner ready that satisfied everyone at the table. Today, the trick feels nostalgic, but back then it was a piece of kitchen magic built out of practicality and care. Pre-browning beef before casseroles was one of those small steps that changed the entire character of a dish. Grandma knew that tossing raw beef straight into a bake would leave it greasy, uneven, and heavy. By frying it first, carefully draining the fat, and sometimes seasoning it in the skillet, she created a clean, flavorful base. This simple act gave casseroles a deeper, richer taste, while also keeping the texture balanced so the final dish wasn't soggy or mushy. When paired with pasta, rice, or vegetables, that first step of browning ensured harmony among all the ingredients. Families grew used to casseroles that were hearty but never overwhelming, because technique mattered as much as thrift. It showed that skill in cooking didn't have to be elaborate. It was about respecting each step. Today, many recipes still include this instruction, though people sometimes skip it, forgetting why it mattered. Back then, it was common sense, part of the rhythm of daily cooking, a habit that quietly shaped meals we still remember fondly. Freezing raw beef mixtures was a trick that made busy days easier long before the idea of meal prep had a name. Grandma would mix ground beef with fillers like oats, rice, breadcrumbs, or shredded vegetables, shape them into loaves, patties, or meatballs, and tuck them neatly into the freezer. When dinner time came, the hardest part of the work was already done. She could pull one out, bake or fry it, and have dinner ready in no time. This habit kept food from spoiling since fresh beef could go bad quickly, but frozen mixtures stayed safe for weeks. For larger families, this preparation was essential, allowing her to adapt quickly if unexpected guests showed up or if schedules got busy. Unlike store-bought frozen dinners, these meals were homemade, hearty, and full of care. The freezer became a quiet tool of stability in kitchens where planning ahead was survival. Those little parcels of beef weren't just food. They were foresight, comfort, and reassurance that no matter what the day brought, a warm, filling meal was always just within reach. Frying leftover meatloaf as sandwich filler was one of Grandma's most clever ways to reinvent yesterday's dinner. She would slice cold meatloaf straight from the fridge, drop it into a hot skillet, and crisp it until the edges sizzled golden while the inside warmed through. Once tucked between bread, sometimes plain, sometimes toasted, it transformed into a hearty sandwich that felt brand new. A swipe of ketchup, mustard, or even leftover gravy turned it into a meal strong enough to rival anything from a diner. This trick meant leftovers never felt repetitive, and kids often had no idea they were eating yesterday's dinner. The crispy edges against soft bread made every bite memorable, the kind of flavor that stuck with you. For lunchboxes, it was a treat disguised as thrift, and many still recall the taste decades later. It was resourcefulness wrapped in comfort, proof that creativity made nothing feel wasted. Today, leftovers often get tossed aside, but back then they were opportunities. Grandma's frying trick showed that with just a little imagination, food could shine twice. Layering beef under mashed potatoes was one of those comforting tricks that turned scraps into something special. If there were bits of ground beef left from dinner, Grandma didn't discard them. She layered them into a dish and covered them with fluffy mashed potatoes. Baked in the oven, it transformed into a hearty shepherd's pie that felt like a whole new meal. This trick gave leftovers a second life, while also ensuring that no one left the table hungry. The contrast between the savory beef and creamy potatoes made it a family favorite, even if it began as scraps. For kids, it was simply delicious, while for adults, it was a clever way of making sure the budget stretched further. It showed how resourcefulness could create comfort food that felt intentional and warm. Today, shepherd's pie is still enjoyed, but its origins as a thrifty leftover dish are often forgotten. Back then, it wasn't about style or trend, it was about making the most out of what you had. That practical mindset turned simple ingredients into meals that carried meaning, and that's why dishes like these linger in memory long after they leave the table. Making stock with beef bones and scraps was a habit rooted in a no-waste philosophy that defined Grandma's cooking. Whenever bones or trimmings were left behind, they weren't discarded. They went into a pot with water, vegetables, and seasonings. Slowly simmered, they produced a rich, flavorful broth that became the base for soups, stews, or gravies. This was how every part of the animal was respected and used to its fullest. The stock added depth to meals, turning simple ingredients into something layered and comforting. Families may not have realized it at the time, but that broth was what gave soups their soul. It was economical too, as it stretched meals further without requiring new ingredients. Today, many people buy boxed stock, but the homemade version was a staple of kitchens that couldn't afford waste. It carried the aroma of patience, filling the house with warmth while it simmered away. The act of making stock wasn't just thrifty, it was symbolic of a time when resourcefulness shaped every meal. It ensured that nothing ever went unappreciated and that even scraps had the chance to bring nourishment and comfort back to the table. Combining beef with lentils or beans was another trick that showed Grandma's genius for stretching protein. A handful of lentils or a can of beans mixed into ground beef doubled the volume and made meals heartier without doubling the cost. The legumes absorbed flavors beautifully, blending right into chilies, soups, or skillet meals. They also added nutrition, making dishes higher in fiber and protein while lowering the overall cost per serving. Families might not have even noticed they were eating less meat because the meals still tasted full and satisfying. This was a practical solution during times when money or rations were tight, but it was also a healthy one. The result was food that felt abundant, even when it wasn't extravagant. Today, the idea of mixing beans into beef is often promoted as modern, but it has deep roots in kitchens that already mastered the art of balance. For Grandma, it wasn't a trend, it was common sense. Every scoop of beans or lentils meant more mouths fed and fewer worries about running out. It was a lesson in how simplicity and ingenuity could create abundance out of scarcity. Pan frying with a touch of vinegar was one of those small but effective tricks that made a big difference in flavor. When frying ground beef, a splash of vinegar cut through the grease and brightened the overall taste. It kept the dish from feeling too heavy and added a subtle tang that balanced the richness of the meat. This trick was particularly useful for skillet meals or gravies, where the beef could easily overwhelm the other flavors. The vinegar acted as a secret seasoning, lifting the dish without anyone realizing what had been added. It was also a way to tenderize the meat slightly, making it more enjoyable to eat. Families didn't question why the beef tasted better, they just knew it did. Today, we think of vinegar mostly as a salad ingredient, but back then, it had a place in everyday cooking as well. This was one of those clever touches that showed Grandma's instinct for flavor, proof that she didn't need fancy spices or complex recipes to elevate a meal. All it took was a splash of something simple to turn an ordinary pan of beef into something unexpectedly memorable. Rolling beef into cabbage or lettuce leaves was both practical and comforting. Grandma knew that wrapping ground beef in leaves created neat little portions that looked appealing and stretched the meat further. The leaves themselves added bulk, flavor, and nutrition, turning what might have been a small serving of beef into a full meal. Cabbage leaves simmered in tomato sauce gave you stuffed rolls, while lettuce leaves made lighter versions that could be eaten fresh. It was an adaptable trick that suited both hearty winter dinners and lighter summer meals. For families, it provided variety while still relying on the same core ingredient. Kids often loved the novelty of unwrapping the rolls, while adults appreciated how filling they were. This method also meant no one felt shortchanged, even if the beef inside was just a small portion. It was a dish of care and intention, built from the desire to make meals stretch without sacrificing comfort. Today, stuffed leaves feel like a specialty dish, but back then, they were everyday proof of thrift and ingenuity. They carried the taste of home, reminding everyone that resourcefulness could always find a way to feed a family well. Using ketchup as a glaze was one of those simple touches that gave meatloaf its unmistakable look and flavor. Spread over the top before baking, the ketchup caramelized in the oven, turning into a sticky, sweet coating that balanced the savory beef beneath. It added color that made the dish look more appealing, and kids often loved that familiar, tangy sweetness. For families who grew up on this dish, the glaze became as iconic as the loaf itself. It was an inexpensive trick that elevated plain ground beef into something memorable and comforting. Even today, many people still crave that shiny red topping, not just for the taste, but for the nostalgia it carries. This glaze proved that even a humble pantry item could become the finishing touch that defined a meal. It was never about extravagance, but about turning the ordinary into something people remembered long after dinner was done. Folding in cooked barley was another clever trick that turned ground beef into something heartier without costing more. Barley was cheap, filling, and had a nutty flavor that paired perfectly with beef. Once cooked and added to the meat, it absorbed juices and spices, stretching the mixture into larger portions. Families didn't just get more food, they got a meal that felt satisfying and rustic, with a chewy texture that stood out from plain beef alone. This was especially common during hard times when making meat last was a necessity. The grain gave the illusion of abundance and made sure no one left the table hungry. Barley also brought a wholesome quality, adding nutrition while keeping costs low. Today, barley has mostly been forgotten in beef dishes, but its role in old kitchens was vital. It showed that the best fillers weren't bland. They actually added flavor and substance that made meals taste richer. Serving beef over toast or biscuits was one of the thriftiest ways Grandma stretched a small skillet of meat. Instead of adding more beef, she would take the cooked mixture, make a simple gravy, and spoon it generously over slices of bread or warm biscuits. This created the illusion of a bigger meal, since the bread soaked up the juices and made each bite hearty. It was the kind of dish that filled plates quickly and satisfied hungry mouths without needing much meat at all. For working families, this trick turned a half-pound of beef into enough for dinner, and the smell of warm bread and gravy was enough to make it feel like a treat. It was economical, practical, and comforting all at once. Many children grew up associating this dish with rainy days and cozy evenings, not realizing it was born from thrift. It was another example of turning less into more with a bit of kitchen know-how. Seasoning with celery salt was one of those overlooked tricks that quietly lifted the flavor of ground beef. Instead of using expensive spice blends, Grandma often reached for this inexpensive pantry staple. The celery flavor brought a subtle freshness that balanced the richness of beef, making simple patties, stews, or casseroles taste more complex. A small sprinkle could change the entire character of a dish, giving it depth that plain salt alone never managed. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective, and it quickly became a reliable way to add variety without added cost. For many households, celery salt was a quiet hero in everyday cooking, especially when seasoning options were limited. Today, it's rarely used in beef dishes, yet its ability to brighten flavors hasn't changed. Back then, though, it was part of the rhythm of cooking, a small but meaningful touch that kept meals from ever feeling too plain or repetitive. Simmering beef in canned veggie juice was one of those clever ways to get both flavor and sauce in one step. A can of V8 or plain tomato juice could transform ground beef into a dish that was tangy, savory, and hearty all at once. The juice added moisture, preventing the beef from drying out, while also coating it in a sauce that could be poured over rice, noodles, or bread. This trick was both economical and efficient, using a single ingredient to do the work of several. Families benefited from the added vegetables in the juice, even if they didn't notice, which made it feel healthier too. The flavor was bold, different from plain tomato sauce, and it made dishes stand out from everyday fare. It was resourcefulness wrapped in simplicity, another reminder of how one clever substitution could create something memorable. Today, this hack feels forgotten, but it once carried a sense of ingenuity that families relied on to make meals special. Turning beef into breakfast hash was a clever way of making leftovers feel like a brand new meal. Instead of letting scraps of ground beef go unused, Grandma would crumble them into a skillet with diced potatoes and onions. Fried until golden and crispy, the mixture became a hearty breakfast that kept families full until lunch. This trick was about more than thrift. It was about variety, ensuring that yesterday's dinner didn't feel repetitive. Sometimes eggs were cracked on top or served alongside, making the dish even more satisfying. The sizzling smell of hash in the morning was the kind of aroma that filled kitchens with warmth and comfort. It showed that no ingredient was too small to be reinvented into something substantial. Today, we think of hash as diner food, but it was once a symbol of resourcefulness at home. It turned the act of using leftovers into an opportunity for something delicious and comforting. Mixing in peanut butter for savory stew was one of those surprising wartime tricks that made sense once you tried it. Peanut butter was affordable, shelf-stable, and packed with protein, so it became a clever addition when meat was scarce. Stirred into a beef stew, it thickened the broth and gave it a nutty richness that made the dish feel heartier. It wasn't about making the stew taste like peanuts, but about adding depth and body to the flavor. Families often didn't even know the secret ingredient, only that the meal tasted comforting and filling. This hack proved that resourcefulness could be creative, turning an ordinary stew into something unique. It also showed how flexible ingredients could be when money and rations were tight. Today, the idea might sound unusual, but for Grandma, it was a quiet way to make sure her family got the nourishment they needed without feeling like they were missing out. Cooking beef with bread crust lids was another way to make a small amount of meat feel like a full casserole. Grandma would line the top of a dish with old bread crusts, letting them bake until crispy and golden over the beef below. The bread absorbed juices as it baked, creating a savory topping that was both thrifty and delicious. It added texture and bulk, making the dish more satisfying without requiring extra meat. This clever use of stale bread meant nothing went to waste, and every meal looked like a complete dish. Families loved breaking through the crunchy topping to reach the beef underneath, turning dinner into a small event. It was resourcefulness presented in a way that felt indulgent. Today, we rely on breadcrumbs or cheese for toppings, but this old trick carried its own charm. It transformed scraps into something both practical and memorable, the kind of cleverness that defined Grandma's kitchen. Stretching burgers with egg yolks was one of those quiet secrets that made patties taste richer while making the beef go further. Adding yolks into the mixture gave burgers a velvety texture that felt more luxurious, even when the meat itself was inexpensive. The yolks acted as a binder too, helping patties hold their shape on the skillet or grill. This meant Grandma could take a single pound of beef and shape more patties without them falling apart. The result was burgers that tasted fuller, with a flavor that seemed bigger than the portion size. It was a subtle trick, but it made all the difference for families trying to make meals stretch. Kids thought they were eating a hearty burger, not realizing it was partly thanks to the eggs. Today, most people skip this step, but it's one of those forgotten habits that gave simple food more depth. It was proof that thrift and flavor could go hand in hand. Savory ground beef Jell-O mold sounds like a joke now, but back then, it was an actual dish you could find in cookbooks across the country. Picture this: ground beef cooked with celery and onions, mixed with tomato or beef-flavored gelatin, and poured into a mold to chill. It came out looking like a jelly-covered meatloaf, and yes, people served it with pride. The gelatin acted as a binder and preservative, letting the dish be prepared ahead of time and stored without refrigeration for longer than usual. It was a wartime or emergency pantry trick that somehow found its way into mainstream cooking in the 1960s. Housewives would slice it into wedges and serve it with saltines or a dollop of mayonnaise, believing it was elegant. It was not, but it was practical. Gelatin was cheap and available, and this dish used only one pan and required no baking. Whether it was a result of rationing, cold buffets, or sheer culinary curiosity, it definitely left an impression. Hamburger spoonbread casserole was as southern as sitting on a porch swing with a glass of sweet tea, and it brought all the heartwarming charm you would expect from something served at a 1940s church supper. Spoonbread, for the uninitiated, is not exactly bread and not quite pudding. It is somewhere in between. It is soft, warm, and creamy, like cornbread that has decided to ditch its edges and just melt in your mouth. Now imagine that heavenly texture layered over seasoned ground beef. The beef underneath was usually cooked with onions, garlic, and a dash of pepper or hot sauce. This dish was a hug in a casserole dish, soft, savory, and so filling you might not need anything else on the plate. It was also one of those recipes that always tasted better the next day if there were leftovers at all. But if this feels too soft and cozy for your taste, let us head into something born straight from scarcity and grit. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. Pine needle broth was one of the forgotten miracle foods of early America, a natural tonic hiding in plain sight. At a time when vitamin deficiencies could mean life or death, Native American healers knew that boiling fresh green pine needles would release a flood of nutrients, especially vitamin C. It was not just medicine. It was survival in a cup. The flavor was bright, almost citrusy, with a faint earthy bitterness that made you feel stronger just breathing it in. Families would drink pine needle broth during harsh winters, through long hunting trips, and whenever sickness crept too close. In many ways, it was the original energy drink, long before anyone ever dreamed of cans and chemicals. Modern science eventually caught up and confirmed what traditional cooks already knew. The forest was its own pharmacy, if you knew where to look. And the best part? It took almost nothing to make. Just water, heat, and a handful of needles plucked with respect from a living tree. But sometimes, even when no pot or pan was available, native chefs found a way to cook hearty, life-saving meals using nothing but stones, fire, and ancient ingenuity. Picnic meatloaf squares were a summer favorite long before pasta salad or grilled hot dogs took over the spotlight. You would make a basic meatloaf, ground beef, breadcrumbs, eggs, and seasoning. Then chill it overnight, slice it into neat rectangles, and wrap them in wax paper like little parcels. They were meant to be eaten cold, straight from the cooler, with no heating, no mess, and no complaints. These squares were usually seasoned with dry onion soup mix, a heavy squirt of ketchup, and maybe a dash of Worcestershire sauce if someone was feeling bold. There was something kind of dignified about pulling one out during a picnic and eating it on a paper plate next to potato chips and lemonade. It was meatloaf without ceremony. They were practical, portable, and surprisingly tasty even without being warm. Some families packed them with pickles or thin slices of cheese on the side. Others just ate them plain, savoring the mix of meat, spice, and nostalgia. You could find recipes for these in community cookbooks with titles like Outdoor Favorites or Cold Table Classics. Beef birds, sometimes called mock steak rolls, were the kind of food that made you feel like you were having a fancy dinner, even if the meat came from the budget bin. The idea was simple but genius. Take seasoned ground beef, flatten it out like you are making an edible canvas, roll it up with stuffing or sometimes chopped onions inside, then tie or skewer it like it is some French roast on Sunday dinner. These little bundles were browned in a pan and sometimes finished in gravy, soaking up every bit of flavor like they had been waiting all day for it. The texture was soft, the taste was rich, and the presentation, well, that part made you feel like you were dining at a place that had real cloth napkins. They were a perfect disguise for humble ingredients. And just when you think the American kitchen could not get more inventive, along came a dish that turned ground beef into a noodle-topped flavor bomb with a crunchy surprise. They were called Porcupine meatballs because they looked exactly like that. Tiny ground beef meatballs with stiff little spikes of rice sticking out. Uncooked rice mixed right into the meat would expand while simmering in tomato sauce, giving it a look that was part dinner and part art project. You could find these in old spiral-bound cookbooks with a plastic comb spine, and maybe some notes written in pen along the edges. These meatballs were not about elegance, they were about getting a meal to stretch. The rice helped the beef go farther, the sauce gave it moisture, and kids thought it was fun to look at. Most of the time, the sauce was just canned tomato soup mixed with a little bit of onion or seasoning. No fancy herbs, no Parmesan cheese, just whatever you had. In homes where meat had to be portioned out carefully, Porcupine meatballs were a bit of a magic trick. This was not something you would ever find in a restaurant, but every church cookbook in the country had a version. Corn chip beef bake was born from the kind of pantry raid that happened in kitchens all across America in the 1970s. Imagine this: you have a pound of ground beef, a half bag of corn chips, a can of tomatoes, and that lonely packet of taco seasoning tucked away in the cupboard. What do? You make dinner magic. This casserole was unapologetically crunchy, cheesy, and bold. You browned the beef with onions and taco seasoning, then layered it with crushed Fritos, cheese, and tomatoes. Some folks threw in a can of kidney beans, others swore by adding sour cream on top right before serving. No matter how you spun it, this dish was like a Tex-Mex lasagna dreamed up during a grocery store strike. It baked into a bubbling, golden masterpiece that was equal parts nacho, taco, and weeknight savior. Parents swore by it for potlucks, and just like that, a new casserole classic was born. But if you think that is inventive, wait until you see how cabbage and beef teamed up to stretch every dollar without missing a beat. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Using ash to soften beans faster without soaking overnight sounds like a wild trick from another world, but for Native American cooks, it was just another part of making the impossible work. In times when waiting 12 hours for beans to soften was not an option, they found a genius shortcut that we have almost completely forgotten. By adding clean wood ash into the pot, the alkaline properties would work their way into the beans, breaking down the tough outer skins and speeding up the softening process. It was not just about saving time either. In many ways, it was about survival. A quicker meal could mean a safer night, a full stomach before a long journey, or simply a little more freedom in a hard world. Even today, chefs who understand this trick know that beans softened this way have a richer, earthier flavor you simply cannot get from a modern soak. It is a reminder that real food was about more than recipes. It was about trust in the land itself. And if you think cooking with ash is clever, wait until you see what they did with clay and fire to make meat so tender it would almost melt in your hands. Cowboy pie was rough and hearty. Ground beef, baked beans, and a biscuit topping that crisped up in the oven just enough to hold everything together. There were no cowboys involved, but it felt like something a hungry ranch hand would love. It was warm, it was messy, and it filled you right up. The base was usually ground beef cooked down with onions, and sometimes a little barbecue sauce or ketchup, then a layer of baked beans, canned of course, and a topping of drop biscuits or biscuit dough from a box. When it came out of the oven, it was golden and bubbling and maybe a little lopsided. No one cared. It was dependable. You served it with a spoon straight from the pan and hoped there was enough left for seconds. The kind you made when the pantry was running low but dinner still had to happen. And somehow, it always hit the spot. Bunless stuffed onion burgers were like something straight out of a low-carb fever dream, but in the 1970s they were downright trendy. Back then, people were starting to think more about their diets, less bread, more vegetables, that sort of thing, but they were not about to give up ground beef. So, someone had the brilliant idea to turn onions into edible burger buns. Here is how it went. You hollowed out a whole onion, filled the center with seasoned ground beef, sometimes mixed with breadcrumbs, cheese, or egg, then sealed it up and baked it in the oven until the onion softened and the beef cooked through. The outside got golden and sweet, the inside juicy and rich. Sometimes a little tomato sauce or barbecue glaze was poured over the top, making it look fancy enough for company, but still easy enough to make on a Wednesday night. It was strange, it was bold, and it worked. These burgers were filling, full of flavor, and just different enough to be exciting. And if you thought stuffed onions were the height of beefy comfort, wait until you see what happened when mashed potatoes got paired with gravy thick enough to stand a spoon in. The trick of smoking corn husks for deep, sweet flavor might sound simple today, but it was revolutionary in the world of ancient cooking. Corn was life to many native communities, not just a crop, but a living gift. Every part of it was precious, especially the husks. By soaking them lightly and laying them over hot coals or wrapping food inside them, cooks could infuse whatever they were making with a smoky, sweet richness that no wood or spice could ever truly replace. Smoking corn husks became a way to turn plain dishes into something sacred, layering that faint sweetness into meats, vegetables, even simple bread. It was an invisible ingredient, a secret handshake between the land and the plate. Today, a few high-end restaurants still use this trick, usually without telling you, because the result feels so natural, so impossibly rich, that diners are left wondering what kind of sorcery they have just eaten. But corn was not the only plant they turned to for hidden flavor and power. If you knew where to look, even the tallest pine trees offered a secret recipe for survival. Sweet sour ground beef with pineapple was not subtle, but that is what made it shine. It was a stovetop dish you cooked in one big skillet. Ground beef browned with onions, then simmered in a mixture of pineapple chunks, vinegar, ketchup, and brown sugar. It smelled like takeout. It tasted like a tropical potluck, and it felt like a vacation, even when dinner was just in your tiny kitchen with the window cracked open. The sweetness from the pineapple and sugar mixed with the tang of vinegar to give the beef a punchy, bold flavor that clung to every grain of rice. This was the kind of dish that made kids ask for seconds, even if they did not love onions or peppers. You could find it in cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s, usually in a section called International Flair or Creative Ground Beef Dinners. It was experimental, but not in a bad way. This dish was about making something exciting with what you had. Canned pineapple, cheap beef, sugar from the pantry. That was it. Yet somehow it came together like magic. Dishes like this reminded people that food could be fun, even when times were not. Wartime ration hash was not glamorous. It did not pretend to be. But in homes across America during the 1940s, it was dinner, and often a lifesaver. This dish was the ultimate answer to food rationing and meat shortages. You would take whatever you had, maybe a handful of ground beef, a bruised potato, a few limp carrots, and you made it work. Breadcrumbs or oats were added to stretch the beef as far as it could possibly go. Sometimes there were bits of canned green beans or peas tossed in, and if you were lucky, an egg to bind it all together. Everything went into a pan and got crisped until the edges browned and the bottom stuck just a bit to the skillet. Flavor gold, right there. It taught families how to use every last crumb, and it gave a warm, filling meal when the world felt cold and uncertain. But when times got a little better, and people had a bit more to spend, things got saucier, cheesier, and a whole lot more comforting. Meat potato candy is a very strange dish. It's incredibly practical, it's very economical, and it comes out of a time where those two things were all that people wanted in their food. It's something we can thank the Depression and wartime periods for. It was back then that families were stretching things and making nutrient-dense treats out of literally whatever they could find, barter or grow. The dish was something that took some American classics and put them together very nicely. You had mashed potatoes, ground beef, which was usually pork or beef, but even bologna would do, and then you had sugar. Sometimes people would spare a bit of flour so that this could be binded properly. Now most people would also prefer their candy to be like a typical toffee, but times were tough. The idea behind the candy was more practical than it was fun anyway. This time people thought that they would make a calorically dense dish that would be easy to carry around in their pockets and bags instead of needing separate storage. It would also be high in energy, so it would be like an instant pick-me-up. In that regard, I think they did pretty great. Would you use it the same way at work? The original food dehydrators were not made of wires, plastic, or electricity. They were built from nothing but wood, patience, and the heat of the sun itself. Native Americans constructed simple wooden frames, stretching thin strips of meat across them like rough tapestries. Exposed to sunlight and fresh air, the meat would dry slowly, losing its moisture but locking in all the rich, smoky flavor. Sometimes the process was sped up by adding a small, smoldering fire nearby, helping to drive off insects and give the meat an even deeper taste. It was a way of preserving precious food without ice, salt, or chemicals, and the result was nothing short of incredible. Chewy, flavorful strips that could last for weeks or even months. Every bite told a story of the land it came from. Every piece was survival packed into a pocket-sized meal. Jerky might be trendy today, but it started here, with hands stretching meat under a fierce sun and trusting the earth to do the rest. But when it came to sweetening up meals and treats, they had another secret up their sleeves, and it did not involve sugar at all. Before it made its comeback on social media, beef and tater tot hot dish was already a legend in Midwest kitchens. You browned your ground beef with onion, layered it in a casserole dish, topped it with a can of cream soup, mushroom, celery, chicken, and crowned it with frozen tater tots. Then you baked it until it bubbled. The tots crisped up, the meat stayed saucy, and the whole house smelled like a snow day with nothing else to do but eat. It was cheap, easy, and had everything: protein, carbs, salt, and memory. This dish was never about nutrition. It was about morale. It showed up at church dinners, weeknights, and holiday leftovers. It was a blank canvas, too. Add corn, peas, cheese, whatever needed using. The best versions were a little sloppy, with crisp edges and soft centers. The first scoop might burn your tongue, but no one waited. It was casserole as comfort, and it worked. A meal that made you forget the weather, the bills, and the stress, just for a minute. Beef jambalaya bake took everything you loved about Louisiana comfort food and gave it a weeknight twist. Traditional jambalaya was made with shrimp or sausage, but when ground beef was what you had, you did not complain, you improvised. This casserole was warm, spicy, and overflowing with flavor. You would start by browning the beef in a skillet with onions, bell peppers, and celery, the Cajun holy trinity. Toss in some garlic, tomato paste, and a good shake of paprika or cayenne pepper, and suddenly, the whole house smelled like dinner was about to get exciting. Then came the rice, which cooked in the pan with beef broth or tomato juice until everything swelled and soaked up the seasoning. Some families added beans or corn. Others threw cheese on top and baked it for an extra kick. It was the kind of dish that got passed around the table fast and left nothing behind but crumbs. And if you think baking jambalaya was clever, just wait until you see what happens when you stuff a hamburger inside an onion. No bun required. If you think about it, pickled beef balls were really just as old-fashioned. They were born out of a preservation technique that basically combined chopped beef with vinegar, salt, and some spices that were then cured in a briny liquid. This was done so that the meat would last a lot longer than it usually could, and it was likely something that came out of pickled meat traditions stemming from Europe. German Sauerfleisch and the Jewish dish pickled tongue have some pretty strong resemblance to this dish. The acidity of the vinegar would do more than just preserve the meat. It would also be wonderful at tenderizing the meat so that you could actually use cheaper cuts of meat. Most rural families could not afford premium cuts because of how expensive they were, but nobody really liked eating chewy, tough, rubber-like meat. These pickled beef balls were an easy solution, and one that you could make in a batch for a rainy day. Fish wrapped in leaves and steamed over coals was a method so simple and brilliant that it feels almost sacred now. Native American cooks would gather wide, sturdy leaves like those from corn, squash, or even certain wild plants, and use them as natural steam pockets. A freshly caught fish, often seasoned with wild herbs and crushed berries, would be carefully wrapped and placed near smoldering coals or atop heated stones. As the heat rose, the moisture trapped inside the leaves would slowly steam the fish, keeping it impossibly tender, flaky, and infused with the faint, earthy flavor of the leaves themselves. When the leaves were finally peeled back, what you found inside was a dish so fresh and alive you could almost taste the river still running through it. Meals like these were more than food. They were rituals of respect for the land. And speaking of sacred gifts from the earth, few treasures were more important to survival and celebration than the humble acorn ground and transformed into something that would feed generations. Mock Swiss steak with ground beef was not fooling anyone, but no one minded. The original called for a real steak pounded flat and simmered in tomato gravy. The ground beef version skipped all that and made a patty. You browned it in a skillet, poured canned tomatoes over it, added onions, and let it simmer. The result was part burger, part meatloaf. It was soft, it was salty, it was cheap and dependable. In homes where steak was not on the menu, this was how you pretended. People served it with mashed potatoes or egg noodles, maybe a slice of white bread for the gravy. A pound of ground beef could stretch far if you shaped it right. This recipe showed up in many cookbooks from the 1960s and 1970s. It had different names: mock steak, gravy patties, poor man's steak, but the idea stayed. Make something that felt like more than it was. The kind of dinner that said, "This will do," and really meant it. Hamburger gravy over mashed potatoes was the kind of meal that made you feel like you were sitting in a booth at a roadside diner, even if you were just in your pajamas at the kitchen table. This was pure 1950s and 1960s comfort food, humble, hearty, and wonderfully filling. You started by browning ground beef with onions until it was sizzling and fragrant, then stirred in flour and beef broth to create a thick, savory gravy that clung to every bite. Some folks added a splash of milk or a pat of butter for extra richness. Either way, it worked. This dish was cheap, easy, and practically guaranteed to silence a hungry family. It was also endlessly adaptable: peas, corn, even a fried egg on top if you were feeling bold. This was a meal that made leftovers feel like a blessing. And just when you think ground beef could not get more cozy, the next recipe brings in a ring of flaky biscuits and a dose of party time charm straight from your grandmother's cookbook shelf. Spam. Beef hash is a budget-friendly dish that came out during the times where people had literally nothing to work with. The name of the game was stretching whatever bits and pieces of meat you had for as long as you possibly could. This happened to just be the best tool available for doing that, and man, it was seriously efficient. Hash itself was just a chopped and fried mixture of different kinds of meat scraps, potatoes, and onions. It actually goes back several centuries, and the addition of Spam and beef together was something that was a World War II innovation. Spam was something that became a household staple mostly due to the shelf life it had and the incredible amount of affordability. It was something you could also mix in with other kinds of meats to make these hybrid dishes. I'm not talking about meat bits, but actual cuts of meat. Most Spam beef hash recipes had very staple ingredients that everyone was used to, but it was the convenience of having everything packed like that in such a neat little format. Nowadays, Spam's actually making a return thanks to how expensive food in general has become. Rock boiling is one of those lost arts that feels almost too wild to be real, but it absolutely was, and it still works today if you know how to do it. Picture this: you have no metal pot, no pan, nothing but a fire, a handful of food, and a riverbank full of stones. Native American cooks would heat large, clean rocks directly in the fire until they were almost glowing, then carefully drop them into hollowed-out bowls made of bark, animal hide, or clay. The heat from the stones would bring the water to a bubbling boil almost instantly, allowing them to cook stews, boil roots, or even prepare medicinal teas without ever burning the vessel. It was a skill that could mean the difference between an empty belly and a full one. And it was not just functional. It gave the food a subtle mineral richness you cannot replicate any other way. Today, rock boiling feels almost mythical, a forgotten page from a cookbook written by the earth itself. And speaking of earth, some of the most astonishing bread you have never tasted was baked without an oven, without a pan, and sometimes without anything more than a pile of hot ashes. The name alone made kids raise their eyebrows, but once they tasted it, they stopped asking. Upside-down beef casserole was ground beef and vegetables poured into a dish, topped with biscuit dough and baked until golden. Then came the fun part. You flipped it. Or at least tried to. Sometimes it held together, sometimes it did not. But the flavors were always there. The beef had onion, salt, maybe garlic powder if you had it. The vegetables were canned corn, peas, carrots, whatever needed using. The biscuit crust crisped on top and soaked up flavor underneath. It was a hot, messy miracle. This came from a time when housewives were told to make dinner an experience, and this counted. Flipping it added excitement when life had little of it. It was a clever way to turn old ingredients into something new. No rules. Leftovers? In they went. Cheese? Sprinkle it on. Dinner was supposed to be practical, but it could still surprise you. Which of Grandma's beef tricks would you bring back? Drop it in the comments, smash that like, and subscribe for more tasty throwbacks.